Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. It's an interesting question here in the United States. It is, why do rural areas seem to vote more conservative while urban areas tend to vote more liberal? And usually in that context, meaning rural areas voting for the Republican Party and urban areas more likely to vote for the Democratic Party. Because, let's be honest, it's still a two-party system, no matter what the sort of extremes you might have in those parties. And that's what it looks like Ken LaCorte is doing here, and I wanted to see what he says. So I'm going to link this video down below. Make sure that you are supporting that. Of course, let me know what you think down in the comments. Let's see what we got. Now, one thing I do like with the sort of titling of this is not necessarily why are cities Democrat and rural areas Republican, because the platform of parties change because there are new challenges and evolving challenges and political motivations that happen over time. We've seen the platforms of the two major parties in the United States change quite a bit, actually, over decades and even well over the last century or so.
Why are cities liberal and rural areas conservative? We often think of red states and blue states, especially as we watch the presidential election results every 4 years.
Right.
But those maps are a simplistic view of American politics. Looking at county-level maps gets us closer to reality.
Sure, that's not better than the states, of course, but you got to remember too, you vote where the voting is by people, right? It's not by land. So the places that you see, often the blue areas, those are where the people are.
Now, some Republicans love that map, but it really shows land, not people.
Right.
And land doesn't vote.
And I hope you guys understand. I hope you understand that. You see that pop up all the time after elections. They're like, look at this. Look what it shows. And you're like, okay, that's not reality. Like Ken said, that's land.
Here's a look that's even better, which shows the counties raised by population level.
Okay.
This is actually the best look at the American political divide. Liberal cities surrounded by conservative countryside.
Sure. We have very dense cities. We have huge cities.
Look, I live in liberal California, where we also have millions of rural conservative voters.
Yeah, I was about to say that. And even California, even go down a little bit further south than Los Angeles, go to a place like Orange County that is red quite often and voting for Republican Party, voting conservative.
And they're overwhelmed by even more millions of left-leaning voters living in San Francisco and Los Angeles. And it's the same story in New York, Illinois, Oregon, really almost all American states. And it's a pattern we see in many parts of the world as well, with cities in the countryside voting like they're two different countries. What really surprised me when I started researching this video is that in America, this is a very new phenomenon. Like, it happened in my lifetime. I'm Ken LaCorte. This may not be as edgy as my typical video, but if you really want to understand politics, it's a vital one.
I think this will be plenty edgy in the sense of how people respond to this. One thing I've noticed in the years of doing my channel is people are very defensive of these ideas about the geography and the history and what voting has been like.
As always, I try to look past the simplistic explanations and do my best to give you something as close to the actual story as I can manage, at least in 20 minutes. In this video, I'll first explain how it wasn't always like this.
Sure.
Then look at the underlying
Rural areas
values
used
that
to
laid the
vote
groundwork
for the Democratic Party, if you want to look at that.
Then I'll look at history, starting with how LBJ changed everything in the 1960s.
Sure.
Followed up by looking at the decade it split.
Yeah. It brings up Nixon too. Southern strategy, also very important for this.
And finally, what keeps them apart today. What you're about to hear isn't really the red versus blue fight. It's a look at identity and values and who gets left behind when economies change. To me, that's a more interesting story.
Sure. I like how he's going to bring change in this because that's the most important factor. Like I said at the very beginning of the video, politicians and party platforms have to change with new conditions. Look at the history of a voting map and you will see how it's changed a lot in the United States.
So if it wasn't always like this, what was it like? Now, I worked in political campaigns before many of you were born, and then in the news business for decades, but I never fully understood until now how this massive shift has been going on for decades. This chart makes it clear. It shows post-World War II support for Democratic presidential candidates by region. Blue is urban, the green is rural. As you see, in the 40s and 50s, they're pretty equal and move in tandem. Then we
That's
see
very
them both
interesting.
move up, more democratic in the Kennedy and Johnson years.
Now, when you analyze maps and look at history, you always want to know, like, what was going on at those times. And I'm glad this map actually showed that. You see that at the bottom there, the yellow bar, it says the Civil Rights Act. This was a major thing that influenced the parties and how they're going to campaign and who people are going to vote for. It's not the only one of, specific events or not controversies, but, like dilemmas. But it's the major one that you can really start to see the beginning of that divide. You see the other one, interestingly, with like he has kind of an early 90s here. So this is Clinton administration.
Then all the Democratic numbers drop as Richard Nixon is elected twice, but a lot more among that green rural America. The partisan gap, it stays similar until the early 1990s, before the lines separate entirely and they never connect again. In fact, they're still separating. Yeah. The gap between urban and rural presidential voting was 33% in 2020 in the Trump versus Biden contest. In 2024, it widened even more. We're looking at a fundamental restructuring of American politics that happened within a single generation. It's really unprecedented in American history. Mm-hmm. And here's another data point to think about. As recently as 2000, Republicans governed half of the 12 largest American cities.
That's such an interesting one when you look at it, because like famously, New York City, right? It's supposed to be this blue city. Rudy Giuliani, year 2000, was the mayor then, and he was a staunch Republican.
It was the tail end of the GOP urban era. Today, of the top 30 cities,
and you got
27 have Democratic mayors. Only 2 are led by Republicans.
That's such an interesting thing that, brought up Zoran Mamdani. He was a Democratic socialist. And again, we're only 25 years from Rudy Giuliani, a Republican.
The GOP has largely vanished from urban leadership. On the flip side, rural America certainly wasn't always this conservative. In the late 1800s, the People's Party, a genuinely left-wing populist movement, came roaring out of the countryside, pushing for government intervention against banks and railroads. Farmers were the radicals back then. In the early 1900s, socialist organizers built strong bases of support among tenant farmers and coal miners in rural states.
The one thing we should bring up is what is liberal and what does conservative mean? Because that term has also changed, especially in the United States, how it has been applied and how it's used more colloquially than it was with the original sort of founding these. So go back to like the Enlightenment, go back to like go into the 1700s, like into the 1800s, maybe around say like the French Revolution, for example, where a liberal was somebody who wanted free markets, more democratic forms of government, protection of certain rights, I guess. Conservatives were about preserving the status quo. Like in the old times, conservative meant like you supported the monarchy. You supported maybe the status of like the church and religion. Now today, interestingly, you might think that those kind of some of those things may be like swapped, where people say like the conservatives are the ones that want like less government or something like that, and liberals are the ones that may want more safety nets or things like that. So even those terms have changed from their inception back in the Enlightenment.
Socialist Party locals and radical unions flourished in small towns and mining camps, including the industrial workers of the world, which demanded public control of key industries. Yep. Now, today, that framing feels almost impossible. Sure. But it's a good reminder that political geography can and does shift.
Yes, it does.
And someday it will again.
Yep.
So I realize here that I'm mainly talking about urban and rural areas and basically ignoring the suburbs.
Okay. I mean, suburbs can be kind of a mix, kind of depending on where you're at. Because your life may even be different if you're a suburb. Maybe you're working in the city, or maybe you live in the suburb and you work in rural areas. I feel like that would also have an influence maybe over some of your politics, as well as your religious affiliation. Because let's be honest, religious affiliation shapes your political views and vice versa. By the way, noticed he was talking about, like, say, the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, so go back to, like, the 1880s and so, that became something when we had this incredible amount of disparity between rich and poor. Government intervention was very, very small. And it became something in a democratic society became a key voting issue, was to intervene in those issues. That was one of the things where the parties had to really identify themselves. Whereas early on, say, maybe like the Republican Party, for example, was one that you see going back to the, from probably the end of the Civil War until, the 1900s, into the early 1900s was a party for like big business, right? Really supported that. But then you also see like even that kind of evolve when you have certain trendsetters, maybe like Teddy Roosevelt or something come through the Republican Party, who was a progressive.
They're an important part of the political landscape, and their mix of both geographies, they often makes them ground zero for electoral battles. But to really understand that suburban mix, it's still a lot easier to spend our time at the ends of the spectrum. All right, we'll get into the specific moments that broke the map open, but we need to talk about something fundamental: the underlying values that have historically separated urban and rural Americans. And by those
That's good, because those things probably... I was trying to think, maybe I caught myself there, but thinking, what are the things that change, the most when it comes to politics? Is it, again, like the values sort of the people? Is it the party platform? So values will be an interesting thing to look at. If values, whatever we want to call those, how have those changed?
I mean, more than who they vote for, but the psychological, social, and political views that we see between people who live in cities versus the country.
Sure.
In fact, when I started researching this video, I assumed it was mainly going to be about these factors because many of them seem kind of obvious and it's what you hear all over the place.
Sure.
Now, they're important, but as you know, there's a catch, because if they were the primary drivers of the divide, we wouldn't just have seen the changes I just described.
Right.
Like virtually all of the videos I do here, these answers aren't simple. They're an interplay of multiple causes and reactions. I say it a lot, but the world is a complicated place. So let's start with the cities. There's a shorthand that political scientists use to explain why cities trend liberal. The 3 Ds: density, diversity, and degrees. Each one does something different, and together they can look like a machine for producing liberal voters. Start with density.
Sure.
When you pack millions of people into a few square miles,
more organization.
Problems that rural Americans can handle individually become everybody's problem.
It's impossible. Yeah. It requires more management, people living close together. Yeah.
Neighbor's trash is a public health issue.
Sure.
One person's building problems that can affect people around it. A single broken water main can leave thousands of people without water. Everyone shares the same infrastructure: the subways, the parks, the hospitals, because there's no real alternatives. Government stops feeling like an intrusion and starts feeling like the thing that keeps those things moving.
It's fair. It's interesting, again, because you have so many people, that get affected by things. You have to be able to collaborate.
And cities aren't just dense, they're loud and in your face. Homelessness isn't an abstraction when you have to step over someone on your way to work, or see the people doing the fentanyl flop on the sidewalk outside of your apartment. Cities make inequality visible in a way that's hard to ignore as well, and visible problems often produce demand for governmental solutions.
Interesting. Yeah.
They're also diverse.
I kind of like what he said there, where cities and just living in a density makes divisions obvious, where you live away from people, then you are going to be probably a lot more ignorant to what other people are going through, I guess.
Problems often produce demand for governmental solutions. They're also diverse, although I'm not sure I agree with the standard narrative here. It says that cities put you in daily contact with people who look, talk, and live differently than you. Now, that's true.
They do.
But it also goes on to say that exposure tends to reduce the instinct to see outsiders as threatening and nudges people towards policies that protect everyone.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, sometimes, unfortunately, that first thing says reduce the instinct to see outsiders as threatening. It could also honestly have some of the opposite, right? Because sometimes in dense areas, you might see the most division when it comes to people sort of living and attempting to try to interact with their own kind, whatever you want to say that is, and may seem forms of racism, whether they're direct or more passive. So I could see that, but it does at least force the issue, I guess, where you have to confront that, I guess. And I guess that's going to be dependent on the individual and how they experience things.
But I've also seen opposite data that says the more some ethnic groups interact, the less tolerant they become. So I'm not quite sure on that one. Either way, one thing that does seem
probably more nuanced
is the selection effect. Cities draw people who are comfortable with strangers and novelty.
Sure.
They rank higher on the Big Five personality trait of openness, and that correlates with liberal politics even before someone moves to the city. So you're starting off with a population that already leans a certain direction, and then the city can push them even further. Even older urban voters lean further left than their rural counterparts of the same age. It seems to be both who moves there as well as what living there does to you over time.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've always kind of been one, if you have to choose really the things that influence a voter, I think your material conditions are going to determine things more than anything else.
There are degrees. Universities and knowledge economy employers, they cluster in cities, and highly educated workers follow.
Sure.
College education is now one of the strongest predictors of democratic voting, stronger than income or religion in many cases. Now, people sometimes don't believe this, but when I ran FoxNews.com in Manhattan, most of the people who worked there were left of center. They were the ones who lived there and applied for the jobs. And the same thing happens in the San Francisco tech world and a lot of other industries. Okay, so let's turn to the countryside. If cities run on collective solutions, rural America runs on individual ones.
For sure. For sure. By running a, business in a high density area, you're running a factory or something like that. You're working in smaller scale economies, maybe even for yourself, like we're saying, for, in agriculture. Yeah. It's literally an individual life.
When you handle your own problems,
or more individual.
You fix your fence, you hunt food, you run a small business, the government, especially the federal government, can feel less like a partner and more like a stranger with his hand in your pocket and giving you rules from far away.
Because you don't need it probably as much. Like he was saying, if you're running a business or living in an urban area, there has to be management. Totally makes sense why, you'd be less, wanting less government intrusion that way.
Ronald Reagan said it this way.
I think you all know that I've always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are
the government. I'm here to help you.
I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Yeah.
Another thing, rural families often have roots going back generations in the same county, sometimes the same property. And that creates a very different relationship with tradition, with change, and with outside institutions telling you how to live. Again, when somebody in Washington proposes new land use rules or environmental regulations, a rural landowner, he doesn't hear policy. He hears someone who's never been within 100 miles of his property telling him what he can and can't do with it.
It does seem like that would be an instance where you don't relate. Like if you're in a rural area, you don't relate to the politicians that are talking about issues or that affect more dense areas, more urban areas. You probably have less trust. You have less confidence in them, kind of naturally.
Faith plays a stronger role too.
Sure. Yeah, this is something interesting because the vehicle for so many politicians can be the church, a church. Republican Party definitely went in on evangelicals decades ago and had a lot of success with that helped with a lot of the demographic shifts.
Where churches in small towns are more part of the social infrastructure. They're where people gather, celebrate, and grieve, where they make sense of the world. And in a lot of places, the local church is community life. There's one more thing worth mentioning, and it doesn't get said enough. Rural America has genuine grievances that aren't about culture at all. Hospital closures, school consolidations, broadband deserts, infrastructure that hasn't been updated in decades. They're material problems affecting people, and sometimes those people feel that the political system has largely ignored them. Mm-hmm. Now, all this said, the urban...
Because I have also heard that kind of argument too. I have family, that live in rural areas where they also will say at the same breath, they don't trust a lot of maybe those politicians that come from urban areas, but they'll also say that the government also ignores us, out here.
Rural divide, it's not an American phenomenon. The same pattern shows up across dozens of Western democracies. The success of Britain's Brexit vote, adamantly opposed by London's elite, it's a great example. Yeah. And you see similar patterns in a lot of other countries as well.
Yeah, I'd love to hear if you are watching this, you're not from the United States, love to hear your version of this. How similar or different do you feel like it is?
Well, but each country's history got them to that point in a different way. Before I go on, do you need an injury law firm? If you need to find one, it's a tough decision because they're not all the same. There's a reason our sponsor, Morgan & Morgan, is America's largest injury law firm. They've recovered over $30 billion for their clients over 35 years. They're licensed in all 50 states. They've got over 1,000 lawyers and 100 offices nationwide. And they handle more than car accidents. They handle medical malpractice, defective products, injuries at work, you name it. It's fair to say that you don't grow that big without doing something right. And they have a great track record. And they're going to help even if you're not going to court. I mean, I've seen the difference between dealing with a corporation yourself and having a lawyer deal with them.
Yeah.
Too many people leave money on the table because they don't know how to properly fight for it. So if you're ever injured in an accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. Clients don't pay unless they win, so their interests are aligned with yours, not with billable hours. They offer a free case evaluation, so it's worth at least finding out where you stand. To learn more, you can go to forthepeople.com/Ken LaCorte, which is linked below as well.
Back to it.
All right, so back to politics. In America, our history had those two pivot points that I showed you on the chart. Now we'll look at the first one, which is how LBJ changed everything. Before he did that, though, the demographic map of the United States had been going through its own changes, which laid the groundwork.
Sure. Yeah.
It came to be known as the Great Migration. Between the 1920s and 60s, millions of Black Americans left the South, where 90% of them had lived at the time. They moved to northern cities where they became a...
Yeah, economy kind of, I mean, you had the war economy that ended up being a big deal from World War I, which goes until, 1918, 1919, which activated a lot of people, a lot of marginalized people actually into the economy. And with so much industrial growth and industrial power, coming into the United States in that time, remember the industrial cities are not down south. And so, some of that migration, there was some of that had also been going on in the, in the Industrial Revolution. We really think of the Second Industrial Revolution, especially of like the 1880s. And then also leaving some of the more Jim Crow areas where life may be hard for people, African Americans and such. But yeah, that's going to change some demographics as well.
Massive urban percent of them had lived at the time. They moved to northern cities where they became a massive urban voting bloc.
Same thing in World War II.
Without the Great Migration,
the
civil rights realignment might never have had the political weight to reshape the map the way it did. It's one of the most important demographic shifts in American history, and it rarely gets mentioned in this context.
You're right. Yeah, we never really talk about it that much. The Great Migration, what effect that had. Now, what I would have to see, though, is how that did change, because, those voters that are coming up to the north, did they really bring that vote with them? Did they, you're African American living in rural Alabama or something like that. Now you're moving up to Chicago, where you're now going to have a very different, probably lifestyle, although it's going to start, especially from, probably not being very well off to continuing to be not very well off, but you start moving into dense areas and stuff. And I would want to look at the data of how did those voters change in their lifetimes from how they voted early on to later in their life. The ones that really, got into the Great Migration, and then how they voted the rest of their life. That's data I think that would be really important to look at.
The first wave, it was driven by tough life under the South's segregation and Jim Crow laws. Also, the spread of the boll weevil. It's a bug that devastated cotton crops. When your livelihood disappears and the law is actively working against you, it often makes sense to leave. The second wave came with the world wars and the industrial booms that followed. More jobs, more opportunity, and a sense that the North offered blacks a better shot at the American dream. Sure. The numbers are staggering. Between 1910 and 1920, just 10 years, the black
Basically
population of Detroit grew by over 600%.
And that brought a lot of sort of hostility from people that lived in Detroit. They saw these people and they started making, segregated neighborhoods, or trying trying to pressure, people selling homes to not sell. It's kind of the sell to African Americans, kind of the, the NIMBYs and not in my backyard kind of people.
Philadelphia, it more than doubled. Chicago's increased by 150%.
Where the jobs
by
are.
1970, more than 80% of black Americans nationwide lived in cities outside the rural South.
And remember, these are jobs, industrial jobs that were attractive in the same way that they were to Europeans in the 1800s and early 1900s, where you could come in from somewhere, not necessarily have job specialization that requires years and years of training or college education or something. This is what industrialization has done to the economy, is, made the worker, specifically, maybe lower skill workers when dealing with this type of work, made them such an important commodity.
To put that in scale, the migration was larger than any single European ethnic group coming to America. It remade the urban North, and it set the stage for everything that followed. And what followed was the Civil Rights Movement, perhaps culminating when President Johnson pushed through the Civil Rights Act in 1964.
Yeah, this is where the strategy of politicians has to be discussed in here, because you have these conditioned stuff, but how are you going to branch into new demographics to get votes? And the Civil Rights Act was a very important one here because, well, he'll talk about it, but LBJ, he was a Democrat, and the South generally was voting Democrat, although that was starting to shift a little bit already leading up to this. But he was also a Southerner in the sense that he was also a Texan, which made him actually a valuable asset for JFK, who, was a Northern Democrat, right? And bringing someone that's like Southern and he's from Texas was to help, maybe get some of those votes. But it really split up the Democratic Party of what you will see here.
The act unraveled the legal architecture of segregation in schools, workplaces, and public facilities in one stroke. Support for Democrats shot up in both urban and rural areas. But underneath that surge, coalitions that existed for decades started to come apart. Many white Southerners saw it not as basic fairness, but as the federal government forcing social change on their communities, and they started breaking with the Democratic Party as a result.
And you can see what this has now done, though, is created a political vacuum that the Republican Party will also, fill here. And they're getting to that. Nixon was kind of famous for this. You can get the Southern strategy. And that's where you're going to start to see kind of that shift.
What followed was a slow bleed through the Nixon years and beyond. The Democratic Party became increasingly associated with urban voters, civil rights, and cultural change. And it started to feel foreign to rural white voters who'd been part of its coalition for generations. The Great Migration,
which also means it's going to be seen as the more now progressive, where it was much more conservative in the sense of Southern Democrats preserving the status quo, especially of the South, keeping the racial dynamics and the power dynamics, the aristocratic dynamics that had been going on since, well, like forever in the United States history. But now you see as the demographics of the United States have changed, the economic needs, all of that stuff, urbanization and creating. You saw the Democratic Party kind of, at least in the hands of some of these politicians, because it was also very divisive in the Democratic Party for this. But you could see how they changing their strategy to fit their goals of, being elected. And this is, again, why political parties, they change over time. If you don't, you kind of die, because you're not meeting the new needs. And every new successive generation, that's born doesn't feel that tie or that like history with their political party. When every presidential election, for example, we got a whole new 4 years, of new voters that are voting for the first time that aren't necessarily going to, just vote the way that maybe their parents did or something like that, because they don't have nearly as much like the emotional, attachment to the political parties of the past.
And the white rural who'd been part of its coalition for generations. The Great Migration and the white rural realignment are like two sides of the same coin. Two major coalitions shifted sides, and neither side fully understood what was happening at the time. One quick thing, I do my best to get...
Because it was not as overnight as maybe this is making it seem, because there already were some demographic changes. There was kind of some happening in like the 1930s, like we were saying, as a result of the Great Migration. But it wasn't all just like the Civil Rights Act. But in a lot of ways, I feel like that was almost the final straw, maybe? Like the final nail? I don't know.
These right, but if I made a mistake, tell me down below and I'll address it. My script, research notes, they're all down there. Also, I recently learned that for those who watch a lot of the videos here but aren't subscribers, you may not get all of them pushed up by YouTube.
Yeah.
YouTube actually does sentiment analysis on headlines and thumbnails, and if they think something might be too offensive, they keep it inside the tribe.
True. I upload every day, so a lot of you might be like, you do? Some stuff just doesn't get pushed that way, so...
So the civil rights realignment started things moving, but the divergence
Didn't start it. I think
going until the
finished it
90s,
in a lot of
the
ways.
decade it split. And that was fueled by a combination of economic and cultural forces. Let's start with the economy, because the economic story is stark. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, took effect in 1994. It eliminated trade barriers between Mexico, Canada, and the United States.
Interesting how we talk about that, basically like eliminating tariffs between the three countries. And then we talk about, tariffs, especially with Mexico and Canada right now, as it's kind of been brought back, 30 years after those barriers were down. But that did do a lot for the economy. That means American companies also started exporting a lot of their manufacturing to Mexico. Car dealerships or car manufacturers, for example, would do that. People make electronics, outsourcing it there. We hear about outsourcing to like Asia and stuff like that, but Mexico was like also kind of a version of that. It was much closer.
Both parties said it would make everyone richer, but in rural America, the factories started closing. Between NAFTA, automation, and China taking over manufacturing,
China
over 80,000 American plants shut down.
Yeah, remember how big of a change the 1980s were for China. Deng Xiaoping comes in and basically creates this like state capitalism where they're taking in all kinds of investment and outsourcing of stuff to China. It completely booms their economy. So add to that, you had that already going, and now you have another level that in the American backyard. Yeah, the outsourcing of production to not America.
Fewer in the cities where the knowledge and tech economies were starting to boom, and more in small towns and mid-sized cities that had built their entire identity around a
Stuff
single
you can't
industry.
export.
And those jobs didn't come back. Take Danville, Virginia as one example, among thousands. A single textile company, Dan River Mills, employed 6,500 people at 7 mills in 1993. 8 years later, every single one of those jobs was gone. Danville didn't get a tech hub. It got vacant buildings and an opioid crisis, with the drug overdose deaths tripling.
Probably heard about this with coal mining, whole coal mining states or something like West Virginia, how they've turned into almost like third world in certain regions because they're completely dependent on one finite form of, an economy that can change, like the necessity for using coal.
It got vacant buildings and an opioid crisis, with the drug overdose deaths tripling. That opioid crisis, it fed the narrative that people started to believe in small towns across the country, that nobody in power cared about them. The family farms were also disappearing, along with jobs in mining and other industries.
Yeah.
At the same time, cities were getting more cosmopolitan, more secular, more globally connected. Quick social change on gun control, gay rights, and abortion felt to many rural communities like values being forced on them from the outside.
Yeah.
We
haven't really talked about the culture war as much about this, but that was another way that politicians found success is basically trying to invent certain social issues, is even ones that don't affect people more directly, but they just talk about how they exist and then their next existential threat. What a powerful tool to weaponize in any direction.
Voters didn't just disagree with those positions, but felt actively targeted by them. Country music, pickup trucks, the American flag, the cross, they became symbols not just of rural America, but of the Republican Party. The cities had their problems too in the 90s. With urban decay and sky-high crime rates.
Yeah, 90s
they
were
pushed
rough
for
for
gun
that.
restrictions, expanded social services, and police accountability. But cities were also changing in other ways. They were getting richer, more educated, more diverse. Gay communities were becoming a political force. A generation coming out of college had a new set of priorities, and the symbol shifted with them.
This is where we'll see if he gets to it, but I think we're in another demographic shift happening. Like we're in the midst of it. And we'll see if we get a chance to get to it. And I think a lot of it has to do with Donald Trump. I think he was such an outlier in political history that it is forcing a platform shift and maybe even somewhat of a demographic shift. Probably less that than more than the platform shift, which has also then created a reaction by also the Democratic Party. And we'll see if I get a chance to bring that up because I have some thoughts.
Flags, bike lanes, farmers markets. They didn't see the rural reaction as cultural self-defense. they saw bigotry. To many urban voters, the old arguments about guns and God felt like relics. The country was changing, the cities felt like they were leading it, and the Democratic Party was finally saying out loud what a lot of urban Americans had believed for years. And now, what keeps them apart? It's more than just political beliefs, but a set of mechanisms that have made that divide self-sustaining. The chart's divergence line is still moving, and nothing in the current political structure seems built to reverse it, at least nothing that's apparent right now. Start with geographic sorting, which compounds itself every year. Educated young professionals, they leave those small towns that offer little prospects, and they drift left. People who stay put in those small towns, who buy property, start families, put down roots, they tend to drift right.
Yeah, and this is where I think I can see possibly another change happening. A lot of that when they're saying they're going, you're going off to college and all that was in the traditional kind of higher education sense of going to like a traditional university where they say, with people learning all these different subjects and learning all these different things, it made a lot of young adults maybe become more liberal in the American sense. But we also know that the structure of the traditional four-year university is kind of collapsing. It's become unaffordable and it's become not really useful that much anymore. And it's because of the increasing need for things like trade skills, right? I think we're going to be continuing to see, and we're going to see, is more of a push in trade skills. We're not getting as much of an education that's going to be talking as much about, say, like history or some of the like economics and some of the philosophies that may help change somebody's sort of ideas that changes how the way they view politics, but more just getting down to, specific skill sets. So like trade schools. So I'm wondering if as that happens, because those trade schools still too will probably be more in urban areas, you might actually see less of that trend that has been people going into higher education, which, trade schools should be considered, but not necessarily coming out a very different person politically. I feel like that could be something that's happening here.
Over time, each place becomes a more concentrated version of itself. In primary elections, they make it worse. In safe districts, which most districts are now, the only real competition happens in a primary.
This is what, that's true, because we're a two-party system. I actually think people are going to be more invested in primaries right now, and maybe this is the good chance to talk about it, that I think an interesting cause and effect sort of thing, a domino effect has happened just with how much of an outlier President Trump was. And I think the domino before President Trump is social media. The boomers, as we want to call it, went online. Okay, in the 2010s. And what I mean by that is went on to social media in the 2010s. And I would say President Trump was was the first real Republican to utilize that to be able to kind of, jump over the traditional Republican establishment and become this like populist figure, right? And then, so you have that. Now, with him not coming from, that establishment, it made him kind of different than the neoconservatives that had dominated before. Okay. Which also meant that he was it could be a little more random, a little more independent on what he would like to see. And he built it, of course, on some populist things. But then we've seen how some of those things have also divided, say, the Republican Party. One of the big ones is that you'll see was like foreign policy and some of the economic issues. You'll see, for example, the tariff issue, right? That has been very divisive amongst Republicans. And maybe the most divisive one right now is on the foreign policy of how he kind of came in and said, no new wars and stop doing that kind of thing. But then you saw all these entanglements just in this first 2 years of his second term, where you have what happened in Venezuela, the continued, conflict in, say, between Israel and in Gaza, and then of course the Iran one. And unless you've been living under a rock, that has been incredibly divisive for people that have been traditionally Republican. We're seeing, of course, pundits, but a lot of everyday people saying, don't agree, right? Don't like what happened with Iran really being one of the big catalysts for that. Tied into all of this has been a big division in the Republican Party on, say, like support for Israel, and probably a lot more divided than it was like with the Democratic Party, which also was very supportive, but had more people that were a little bit more reluctant for that support, but used to be far more supportive for the Republican Party. Well, anyways, so what that's now done is created this spectrum in the Republican Party now, where you still have the more neocon thing that are like, yes, Iran was a threat, and it was okay to go do these things and getting involved in these other countries, supporting Israel, that kind of thing. But then you have the people that have gone much more against it. A lot, again, traditionally loud voices within the conservative movement. And some of it you've probably seen with pundits, say like Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly. You're seeing the podcasters out there that are doing that. And even some politicians that you see broke off like Marjorie Taylor Greene. But anyways, and some other Republicans, Thomas Massey. But so you've seen that. Then what you've seen, which is, I think we're now in the next thing, is the widening gap between the edges of the Democratic Party. You had your traditional mainstream Democrats, that's your Bidens, that kind of thing, Hillary Clinton, who were very successful at pushing away the far left flank in this country. Right, pushing and keeping that away, keeping Bernie Sanders, for example, who had a lot of popularity, but keeping him out of the presidency, being able to still be popular amongst like donors and centrists and that kind of thing. But now, as a response to what United States, I guess, has become, especially with the Trump administration, you're seeing some Democrats be disillusioned with the Democratic Party, and they're now investing more in more of the left flank of things. And since we have a two-party system, it all falls within the Democratic Party or Republican Party. So, for example, the big wave that's kind of been happening this year in smaller races, right? We may look back and wonder, and we'll see how things play out, of how big an election someone like Zoran Mamdani was in New York City, where you have a Democratic socialist running on the Democratic ticket who had to defeat other Democrats who did not like him and won. And then you're seeing these other races happening that Democratic Socialists are starting to win now. There's multiple ones, and some that are in primaries for countries, whether it's governor or it could be, again, a mayor. But then we'll probably see that interestingly pushed as we get closer to the midterms. This is where, coming back to what Ken was saying, is for the flanks of the Republican and Democratic Party to be successful, you have to go through the primary process. And people generally, I don't think, cared that much about the primaries. You were able to find the more centrists of the two really find their way to the top. Not a lot of people voted in primaries. But now that it seems like there's this like more successful rhetoric happening towards breaking off from your party, and it's seeming to be more of a possibility of happening, I think we're going to see more people getting into and voting in primaries, because this is how the parties have to shift if people are doing it. And more people, I think, are wanting to see that, whether it's the right become more right or more centrist, or with the Democratic Party go left. I think what the Democratic Party did in the 2024 election ended up hurting them a lot when Kamala Harris and some of those establishment Democrats actually tried to pivot a little bit more to the right. They started going in onto issues that the Republicans are already doing, like, maybe closing off administration, supporting some of these foreign conflicts, maybe more, and maybe not taking a harder stance against, say, like Israel. And what a lot of people believed is that, if you were on the far left sort of the Democratic Party, you can no longer support that part of the party, the establishment. And so they're going through their version. And I don't know if that's going to be the Democrats' version of what happened with like the rise of Trump and a populist movement, but it does seem to be almost like a populist movement in a sense that the Democratic Party is now doing. But anyway, coming back to what we kind of started, this is how politics works, and the demographics change, the policies change. Some of it is very intentional by certain politicians that want to go and hit certain demographics. So they change kind of their rhetoric. But anyway, I think we're going to be seeing that now. And we're almost seeing four major factions in American government now, with the Republicans really having their two, and then the Democrats having their two. And this next 2 years, I think, is going to be really interesting, and where it's going to be, where everyone's going to keep their eyes on to see how these splits materialize is through primaries.
Between gerrymandering and other advantages that incumbents have, it's shocking at how rarely one of the 435 members of Congress loses re-election. In 2024, a big political change year, only 11 members of the House lost their general election. 4 had lost their primaries. That's not a lot out of 435.
Right.
And primary voters, they're the most committed, the most hardcore.
And I think there's a lot of incumbents about to be booted out. I think in this next, these midterm elections, like I was saying, I think we might see that. The primaries are going to be very interesting to look at here this year, and they're happening as we speak right now. And we've seen, again, like I said, more success from some of that changing, I think, with the Democrats. Republicans, I don't know yet, because we saw like Massey, he lost, and he was one that kind of broke off from the traditional, I guess, MAGA voters. But his whole idea was that, you know, the what was MAGA is not actually America first anymore. That's what you're seeing. So interested to see how the Republican Party responds to this division that's sort of happening within their population.
Members of each party. And primary voters, they're the most committed,
I think we see how the
most
Democrats
hardcore
are.
members of each party. So the incentives for politicians, it's not to appeal to the middle, it's to excite those superfans by telling them what they want to hear.
Sure.
The result is that the people who represent rural America get more conservative, the people who represent urban America get more liberal.
That's where I still think it's going to be like that. I still don't think we're going to be seeing rural people vote for Democratic Socialists. Like, that's not going to be the case in that sense. So what we saw in the 2024 election, especially with the Democrats, was the far left flank did not show up to vote. They didn't vote because they did not see. They saw the Democratic establishment pivot and try to reach towards the right, and they didn't show up, which I think which is what I think cost them the election. Where the Republican Party was far more united under President Trump. There weren't people that were just not voting, but there were a lot, I think, in the far left that just they didn't show up, and now are using that as the motivation to be like, okay, they showed that. Like, they've got to, their vote's got to be earned by the Democratic Party. So leftists are now using the primary format. You're seeing that, pushing that way hard to see some of these successes happen with more leftist candidates.
And the two sides have less and less to talk about. And then there's the media environment, where most news outlets have become partisan, whether they admit it or not. Sure. Add on top of that the computer algorithms that give each of us a separate diet of the information that we like to hear.
That's fueling the divide as well. We get our politics from our algorithms now. Nobody watches, traditional news. Everybody's getting something that's fed through an algorithm, which is feeding, of course, not just misinformation, but it's creating echo chambers that people are now thinking reality is that sort of thing. And I think that the era of the political algorithm was created now with the Trump with President Trump, which he very much benefited from, was the social media. And so that's going to be another thing. And like I said before too, is in the 2010s that the older generation, it was now the boomers are now in the political algorithm, and they're starting to vote and based off of that.
And because we live near fewer people who we disagree with, there's even less friction to correct it. If there are even any people who challenge your assumptions, they're likely faces on a screen, not people you actually know. Sure. Rural and urban America became two genuinely different lived experiences, each side often seeing the worst motives on the other.
Here's one last thing as this video is ending, that I also see being something that could create a demographic shift, although I don't know how extensive it's going to be. And it has to do with what COVID did to the economy and creating more work from home type of situations for people, where people that maybe were working in urban areas and were more liberal in that sense were now able to work remotely. And a lot of them became disillusioned and, didn't really like the high density maybe area, of some of these cities, and are still kind of retaining their sort of liberal ideas or whatever, but now have the opportunity to enjoy some of the benefits that come from rural living. We are seeing somewhat of an exodus in some way of the highly trained, highly educated work from home, highly skilled work from home people that are actually moving into rural areas. Some of that too is because it's cheaper to live there, but some of them just want to get out there that actually are more liberal, but are going to be going into these rural areas because it doesn't matter where you live anymore. That is interestingly is happening. That is one thing you could potentially see the demographics change a little bit with voting. It's not that like urban people who live because they have an urban a rural sort of lifestyle in the sense that that's the type of work they do or whatever, are going to see these people moving from cities there that keep their liberal values, but are able to work and live in those rural areas, and what that might do to the demographics. I think we're at the very, very beginning of that, but I still think, and I think you guys have seen the shift to work at home is now not making people have to be tethered to cities anymore. So you may see a scattering, I think, of that more liberal demographic hitting the rural areas.
We're still seeing some realignments, though. The Trump coalition reshuffled things in a way that really didn't fit the old map neatly.
Right.
More working class voters of all races, fewer college-educated suburbanites. Whether that represents a genuine reordering or just a temporary disruption, that's a fascinating question for the next few years. But the underlying structure, the self-sorting, the media silos, those aren't going anywhere. They're going to outlast politicians. It's baked into the system until something we probably don't even know about comes along to change it. Okay, so when I spend a lot of time looking into the growing political divide in America, I sometimes can't help but think we're all going a little crazy. Until I look around the world a bit, then I feel better. And when my gaze stops on North Korea, I think we're all doing pretty well, because that country is certifiably insane.
Just the random shade thrown at North Korea in this right here. It's like, yeah, we can complain about a lot of things, but regardless of what, I guess, political affiliation you are in the United States, you still actually have it pretty good, which is true.
I mean, some of it's goofy, like teaching people that Kim Jong-un learned to drive at age 3, or that his dad invented the hamburger. But most of that crazy...
Or he doesn't poop. Heard that one? He just like doesn't poop. It just like, I don't know, evaporates in his body. That's one of my favorite ones of the Kim dynasty lore.
It's dark and evil, like executing people for watching the wrong TV show. Or if you commit a crime,
it's a segue. That's what all this was.
Your children and grandchildren get locked up with you as well. But how? How did a country of 26 million people go that far off the rails?
Should have said people talk to the police?
No. In the description box below.
Every single lawyer that exists, they never ever talk to the police. All right. Okay. Final thoughts. All right. I think Ken actually did a really good job with this. Hopefully I was able to fill in some nuance or maybe some gaps, I guess, other considerations for that. But I think for the most part, he hit kind of the history and what have been kind of the pivotal events that have changed certain voting patterns. So I tried to bring in at the end there some of my, I guess, hypotheses, I guess you would say, about, you know, what's going to happen in the near future as well as the long-term, you know, future. So tell me what you think about that. And with that, thanks again for hanging out this long, and we'll see you all next time.